So I got an email asking if I would give a 10 to 15-minute presentation. So I thought that I would speak about something which certainly has become very, very clear in this particular pandemic, which is the communication of uncertainty when it comes to informing and guiding public policy in response to the particular crisis that we're in. So although I'm billed to be talking about artificial intelligence, I really don't know anything about AI, and I speak from a statistical, a computational statistical perspective. So let me just set the scene. Can you see this, Nick, this slide with a number of bullet points?
Yes.
Okay, great. So let's remember what we are told every evening at the government press conferences, is that government policy is being guided by the science. Now, a large part of the science that is supporting and guiding public policy and public health policy are a series or a set of mathematical models that are describing the epidemic. And the structure of these models follow the very classical, either deterministic differential equations that describe the dynamics of the particular population in some sort of compartmental way. The other approach, predominant approach, is a stochastic set of differential equations that describe the stochastic dynamics. And then there are, of course, individual level simulations or micro simulations that describe these dynamics. But at the end of the day, they are all based on some sort of compartmental representation that describes transitions of individuals from one state infected to another state susceptible and so on. And the rates of transition are important in the design of control mitigation strategies. So, so these parameters of the models are incredibly important when it comes to control mitigation strategies. Not only enacting them, but communicating what the models and what the data are telling us about the current situation. Now, as statisticians will know that, and probably most mathematicians as well, is that the mathematical models are primarily misspecified. They are some sort of abstraction that describe the bulk effects that are important to us in describing the dynamics of the epidemic. The other thing, of course, is that the data that is available at the onset and then as the epidemic develops will be sparse, will have time lags, will have reporting errors, and so on. And so I suppose the point that I would like to leave with you, for you to argue about and to discuss, is that the modelling, the epidemiological modelling that is required to support government responses and government policies and actions is in essence and should be considered as a statistical inferential problem. If I go to the next slide, hopefully that it's indexed okay for everybody.
We're good.
Yeah, is that the data that is available is typically poor. And that has to do with issues of reporting, issues of the public health infrastructure, and so on. And it has become clear over the last few weeks just how difficult it is to obtain the sort of data that is sufficiently informative to allow communication of the key rates from these models to policymakers. And the statistical estimates of the model variables, which are relevant for public policy development, the rates, and also the sort of structural parameters, nuisance parameters, and so forth, are all going to be reliant upon, well, two things. One is going to be the availability of the data and its quality. And the second one is the assumptions which are either implicit or have been made explicit about the structure of the model, about the course of the dynamics, and so on. So I've already said that the mathematical model is misspecified, but the mathematical model, which is embedded now, I would argue, should be within a statistical model, is also going to be misspecified. So we have imposed distributional assumptions in the data, some which may be supported with good argument based on previous experience of other epidemics, and in some cases it will not be. And so, again, the point I'm trying to make is that when communicating to help guide the development of strategies for exit, for example, is that the characterization of the uncertainty in our models, and that includes the data, quantifying that uncertainty, propagating it, and then subsequently communicating it, all of the sources of uncertainty, as much as possible, should be captured, characterized, quantified, and propagated. And that uncertainty, when we communicate to policymakers, or planners, or strategists, the notion of uncertainty should be communicated in some way, and in some sort of metaphor that is appropriate. Now, unfortunately, all of those things, characterizing, quantifying, propagating, and communicating that uncertainty, is far from straightforward. It requires multiple disciplines. It requires the mathematical modelers, analysts. It requires the epidemiologists. It requires statisticians. It requires public health individuals. It requires those who understand the psychology of communication. And that is very much an active, open research area, and yet is one that requires immediate action in the current crisis. Now, if I go to the next slide, this is a paper which one of my collaborators and colleagues, Thomas House, who I think is actually here, but is also heavily involved in supporting the government or certain government bodies and public health bodies in this particular crisis. And just to give you an example and illustrate why this is important, the quantification, propagation, and communication of uncertainty is important. I give you an example here of this paper, which was published about 4 years ago, just over 4 years ago, in the Royal Society's Interface Journal. And this was looking at the quantification of uncertainty for the transmissibility of a number of particular viral diseases, influenza, norovirus, and so on. The take-home message from that study was the following: that to come up with, say, for example, an exit strategy, a containment strategy, then forward modeling is required to produce scenarios. If we take uncertainty into account, then there were a number of messages that became very clear from this study. If we took influenza and we took data had been made available previously based on shedding, so the viral load that was shed by someone that is infected. Then for influenza, two things were highlighted. First one was that interventions of a quarantine type were robust to the uncertainty associated with the models and with the data. And I'll show you that, I'll explain that in just a bit more detail shortly. On the other hand, interventions, so policy-based interventions based around antiviral interventions, in actual fact, had a very complex uncertainty structure, which actually had two regimes. And that's something that's very difficult to communicate, but it's something that has to be recognized and acknowledged when it comes to communication as far as going to public health bodies is concerned. And similar things were observed with the norovirus set of models, that the frequency of the epidemic, its predictability, was fairly robust under propagated uncertainty, but the timing and the severity of those outbreaks, again, in similar fashion to influenza, was not robust to uncertainty in those predictions. And if I just show you, so you see two columns here. The first column shows three plots. The top one gives the size of the epidemic as the models predict it, and the sort of shading gives an indication of the uncertainty. So dark and compact indicates that that this is fairly certain. So low amounts of uncertainty. If you look at the number of infectious cases, so the percentage of the population, then again, you start to see quite significant levels of uncertainty, but nevertheless, what you see, again, taking a containment strategy, is that we can make some inferences and use this in terms of guidance as far as the number of infectious cases are concerned, and it gives us more information to communicate. And likewise with the number of recovered cases. On the other hand, on the right-hand column, when an antiviral policy is adopted, then what we see is this very complex uncertainty structure where in many ways there are two regimes. So there are two sets of plausible scenarios that are supported by the current evidence, in this case the shedding data, and the assumptions underlying the structures of the influenza models. And what it tells us is that the situation is not as straightforward as certainly a politician would want to see, and the communication of this uncertainty becomes quite complex. The reason for that complexity in the forward forecasts as the models are run is in essence because of the characteristics of the sampling distribution over the unknown parameters. So the rates of moving from one compartment to another, the transmissibility, the recovery rate, and so on. And I won't go through these figures here, but two things that you should see is that given the data, the time course that's available, The induced distributions over the unknowns, transmissibility rates, recovery rates, is extremely complex within the space that we reside in. And in fact, you can actually see there's a sort of bimodality, but there's also a very strong concentration of that measure within the space. And from a computational perspective, computational statistical perspective, this raises a huge number of issues in terms of, have we really been able to sample the region where the uncertainty is characterized within the parameter or the variable space. Now, I should say that we took a Bayesian perspective, so assumptions or admitting a lack of information was characterized within a number of priors. So what you're seeing here are posteriors given the data over the parameters. And what you see here is the ensemble of forecasts given the delay to when the the interventions took place, and what the size of the epidemic was, what the number of infectious cases were, and so on. And that uncertainty in the posterior is forward propagated into the quantities of interest that are typically used to communicate to those that are going to be informing policy. So just to summarize the sort of thoughts that I wanted to leave with you to either ignore or discuss or disagree with, whatever. But I think that's the job that I was given in these 15 minutes, is that the quantification of uncertainty really needs to be taken seriously. And I mean, I've seen from firsthand how complex this actually is, given the complexity of the current virus, and given the complexity of bringing experts together, getting common sets of data, common sets of or understood models, and so on. But the characterization of the sampling distributions to allow us to quantify uncertainty and to propagate it and subsequently communicate it is dependent on the data. It's dependent on the complexity of the models. And it's also going to be dependent on the statistical framework that is adopted. And the forward simulation, so the ensemble of forecasts in the paper that I've just shown you, is basically giving posterior forecasts. And if all of the modeling groups that we are relying on were to give posterior forecasts, we would certainly be in a strong position, and that's not the case at present. The challenges just of simulation and of sensitivity to the model choices is really extremely high for various technical reasons, which I won't go into, but issues of identifiability, measure concentration, and so on. So some groups of epidemiological modeling teams are fully embedded within some sort of statistical framework. And that's great, but not all are. And that is something that we really need to work on trying to support. So I guess I'll close there by just leaving the three things. We need to quantify uncertainty, we need to propagate it, and we need to be able to communicate it. And that requires multidisciplinary engagement at a very deep level. So I'll stop there. I think I've spoken for just over 15 minutes.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Mark. And this was, I think, a very important point to make, especially when we're dealing with people coming into epidemiology from other disciplines like physics or engineering, where they may not be aware of the nature of those types of uncertainty. So I'm not going to open the floor for discussion in the interest of time, but like to thank Mark again.